Hi, and welcome. My name is Elise Moores. I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at National Philanthropic Trust. Thank you for joining us today and for giving us some of your time to discuss the important topic of philanthropic planning and the client review. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Janos Major and Matthias McKay. Both are regional directors here at NPT, and they work closely with advisors and donors to help folks achieve their philanthropic goals. Janos and Matthias, thank you so much for leading us in this discussion today.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us. And as Elise mentioned, I'm Janos Major. I'm Regional Director of the West for National Philanthropic Trust based in the Bay Area, and joined by Matthias McKay, who's our Midwest rep based in Chicago. I'll let him introduce himself in a few moments. But the goal today is ultimately to really leave you with some hopefully actionable ideas and ways to implement philanthropy into your regular quarterly or annual reviews with your clients to make it a more of a regular practice to speak to your clients about this, as it is an important topic for especially the high net worth and ultra high net worth clients that are out there, but for all the clients that you work with. And before we kind of dive into the meat of it, if we can just start on the next slide, please. I'd like to, I guess, first illustrate this by sharing a story. We had a donor a few years ago that they were retired. They were already pretty philanthropically inclined, and they were doing an annual review with one of the advisors that we work with. And during that review, talking about their retirement, the idea of legacy planning came up, and what did they want their legacy to look like? The clients themselves had no heirs, so they had a large estate. That really they were trying to figure out what to do with in the long run. They had enough liquidity to live comfortably in retirement, but as they tend to do with lifestyle creep, they had a lot of items that they also had in possession that were not liquid. Things like this violin. They had other collectibles, art. They had a lot of things that are part of their estate that they were trying to figure out what to do with. And the advisor had mentioned to them, the concept of maybe gifting some of these to a donor advised fund as part of their legacy, being able to leverage a DAF. And again, this is not a great tax deduction for the client. There's no what we would call related use, because as a donor advised fund, we're not publicly displaying any of these items to the public to be able to view. They're simply just going to get a cost basis deduction. But truthfully, the clients were fine with this, right? They weren't looking at this as a tax opportunity. They were looking at it as a way to convert, a piece of history into philanthropic capital to give out to the charities they cared about. So they were able to gift this to a DAF. We were able to ultimately liquidate, some of these collectibles, and now they're able to, use that cash to be able to give it to organizations to help further education, help medical research, the things that they were caring about. And for the advisor, this was also a big win, right? And there's the opportunity for them to take some of this capital, start managing it within the donor advised fund, where otherwise they wouldn't be able to do something like that. So for everybody, it was a great opportunity to leverage philanthropy to not only deepen a client relationship, to grow their book, but to come back with a way to find a solution to a problem that they initially had brought up. If we can move on to the next slide. So the goal today is, again, we have kind of 4 quick agenda items. The first is really setting the stage on what is the opportunity. How, if you incorporate philanthropy more regularly into your practice, what are the benefits that you could get out of it? How do you initiate those conversations? How do you get deeper into the conversation about philanthropy? How do you incorporate a donor advised fund as part of your regular reviews? And ultimately, what are the resources that at MPT we could be providing to you to help support you during those client conversations? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So again, we're going to set the stage first with what the philanthropic opportunity is, and it's, in my opinion, pretty massive. We can see here from last year's Bank of America report that over 90% of wealthy individuals had given to charity within the last year. And of that, I would say even the 1 out of 10 that said they didn't give in the last year has probably given in the last 5. But the truth is only 3 out of 10 actually talk to their advisor about philanthropy when they put their investment plans together. Again, as advisors, I know when I started out, I like to sit in my wheelhouse talking about retirement planning, investment planning, portfolio management. The idea of talking about philanthropy was a little bit different, a little bit esoteric. So it was something that I really kind of touched on, but didn't really dive deeply into. And I remember as I was studying for my chartered advisor in philanthropy, the CAP program. There was a study done. This is a 7-year-old study at this point in 2018, done by the Philanthropic Initiative that basically asks the simple question of who initiates this conversation. And depending on who you asked, you got different answers. You talked to an advisor, 60% of advisors responded and said they're the ones that are driving this conversation. It's them almost all the time. But then you talk to their clients and you say, who is initiating the conversation? Of course, the client says 70% of the time it's me, right? I'm the one bringing it to my advisor to talk about philanthropy. So, we know that this is a conversation that needs to happen and should be happening regularly, but a lot of times it's not the advisor that's always initiating it. The client's kind of figuring it out on their own. And I remember again when I first started, I would have clients call in. They would, ask for like a $10,000 cash raise and say, "Hey, I'm gonna give some money to my alma mater," and I would take the trade instructions, I would get the wire instructions, I would take care of it and move on. And of course, you have some of these clients that are doing this on a regular basis. They're calling you monthly for this $10,000 cash raise to send to their alma mater. And again, this is an opportunity where you can identify and say, hey, if you're setting regular, reoccurring, effectively grants to an organization, maybe we could talk about a donor advised fund and lumping some of those together, as an opportunity to not only educate, but find a solution for your clients. So again, that's the goal today. If we can move on to the next slide. So again, why does this ultimately matter to you and your clients? First, again, it's a deeper conversation. This is something that's very personal to your clients about what are their, care about, what are their passions, what are the things that they want to improve in the world. For you as an advisor, as we, talked about that violin and other collectibles, it's a way for you to expand the balance sheet. We can take things like private business interests. We can take things like restricted stock. We can, of course, take other liquid assets that have large embedded capital gains. All those things are opportunities for you to leverage philanthropy to not only get a charitable deduction, but avoid capital gains and build a book as well. And then, of course, the most important thing is probably being able to work with multiple generations, right? Philanthropy is something that is passed down from generation to generation. If you're working with Gen 1 right now and you're not familiar with who Gen 2 and Gen 3 are, there's a risk that when the client passes away, those assets go to Gen 2's advisor instead of yours. Leveraging philanthropy is a great way to learn who the next generation is, start building those connections to be able to, hopefully start managing those assets more continuously and effectively make them more sticky. So with that all in mind, I wanted to have Matthias introduce himself a little bit more and maybe talk a little bit more about how donor advised funds work and share some of his ideas.
Janos, thank you so much. And as Janos mentioned, my name is Matthias McKay. I'm the Regional Director for Development for National Philanthropic Trust, based here in Chicago. I cover most of the Midwest for us. And I'm so glad you mentioned that last slide, the deepening, the expanding, and the strengthening of a client relationship. I had a really good mentor when I started my career as a financial advisor, and he used to say, the person who knows what always works for the person who knows how, always works for the person who knows why. And Janos, you covered really well. Why do we want to talk about philanthropy and donor advised funds, right? It gets to a level that's deeper than asset allocation and return, gets to kind of that kinesthetic level of financial planning. But let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about what a donor advised fund is and how National Philanthropic Trust works with our advisors and donors to make a really compelling offering for the donor advised fund space. So donor advised funds exist in three stages: give, grow, and grant. So donor contributes an asset. It's typically a long-term capital gain asset for which they are awarded a fair market value deduction against their adjusted gross income. That money can then be invested in the donor advised fund on a tax preferred basis and then granted out to the charities the donor wants to support, hopefully to alleviate suffering and elevate human dignity. Now, really, at each of these three stages, National Philanthropic Trust has some competitive advantages that really make the conversation, I think, quite compelling, especially for advisors in the private banking and family office and high net worth space, right? So on that giving stage, donors can contribute complex and illiquid assets, and NPT has the appetite, sophistication, and experience to take in, hold, and liquidate those complex and illiquid assets. So think your clients that are maybe compensated in restricted stock. Maybe they're clients that are business owners, have privately held S Corp, C Corp, partnership, LLC. Maybe they have exposure to alternative fund structures such as private equity, hedge funds, maybe something like crypto or real estate. Those are all things that NPT has experience taking in and turning into philanthropic capital. In that second stage, there's really two big differentiators I like to highlight. The first is above a certain minimum, NPT can go open architecture for your investment portfolio. That means you as the advisor can manage the funds similar to probably how you're used to managing the funds outside their philanthropic capital in what's called a segregated account, discretionary account, individually managed account, wrap account, whatever we're calling them these days. It's a discretionary management account. And the second competitive advantage I think is really important because I used to have a lot of clients when I was an advisor. They were worth a lot of money, maybe doesn't necessarily have a lot of liquidity. And that is NPT can get highly concentrated above 90% in a particular position. So think your clients that are maybe concentrated in one particular security, or maybe a lot of their wealth is tied up in their business. This can be a powerful conversation to start unlocking capital for philanthropic purposes. And on the grant making stage, NPT does all our grant making due diligence in-house. That means if you have a question, you can reach out to us and we can have that conversation and troubleshoot. NPT also does a lot of international grant making, and that's something that's pretty time consuming and onerous. Not many other organizations do it, and I'm not aware of anyone that does it on the scale that NPT does. So for our clients that have affinity to international NGOs, this can be a really compelling conversation. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about, so Janos mentioned the deepen, the strengthen, and expand inside the donor advised fund. And we've already seen over the past decade, advisors really take to that 637% growth in donor advised fund accounts over the past 10 years. That's a really high number. So what I want to convey to people is if you're not having conversations with your clients about this, and we'll talk about how that conversation works in a second, maybe the advisor across the street is, and we want to avoid that from happening, right? And so we want them to hear that idea from you first. And so let's go to the next slide. And I mentioned earlier, I had this really great mentor when I started as a financial advisor, and he would say things to me, and I think being younger in my career, it didn't always stick to me then. But I remember he would talk about literature a lot, and there's a Dostoevsky novel called The Brother Karamazov. And there's a line in there that says, true generosity begins not with abundance, but with responsibility, recognizing that we are all bound up in one another, right? And really, when we think about it, he mentioned, being a financial advisor is just such an important job because really the people behind their family, maybe their faith or their culture, their money is probably one of the most important things to them and really allows them to do what they want to do in life. And that's an incredible responsibility. So let's go to the next slide and let's talk about how we have that conversation, maybe to clients who haven't engaged you in that philanthropic conversation yet. And then we'll talk about some of our maybe more experienced, mature, or sophisticated philanthropic clients. And so I always like to start these conversations with what I call kind of a power question, right? And it's an open-ended question to really get the conversation going. And that can be as simple as, what causes or charities do you currently support? What giving vehicles do you currently use? I remember an advisor came to me and said, hey, we process, similar to Janos's story, a $10,000 wire every month to a charity. Does that mean they're philanthropically inclined? I said, absolutely, that's what that means, right? And if you're not having that conversation, maybe another advisor is. And so anytime there's a life event, anytime we're having that planning conversation, or really that legacy conversation, philanthropic planning should be something that we at least touch on, if not dive deeper into. So let's go to the next slide. Maybe you already have some clients, or maybe you are already really experienced at having these conversations with clients, right? Leveling up that conversation, upgrading that conversation, getting involved in family dynamics, understanding how their family fits into their philanthropic picture, what they want their legacy to be, what other charitable strategies they can do to optimize their giving. So maybe they're really sophisticated on the philanthropy side, but maybe not so sophisticated on the tax planning or financial planning side. That's an opportunity to add some value. And so we want you to have those conversations. And so if ever that question comes up and you want to kind of have us be a sounding board or give you a few ideas to that end, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help. And so with that, I want to turn it back over to Janos to talk about a couple other strategies that he's used in the past.
Thanks, Matthias. Again, the goal today is to take some actionable items away to help you, have better conversations and hopefully share some ideas as well. And the first one, of course, is just really, we get this question a lot. How does a DAF, donor advised fund, compare to a private foundation? And this conversation is not meant to be an either or, right? And you can have multiple giving vehicles. We have many donors who have a private foundation along with a donor advised fund. A lot of them will even have a donor advised fund with us as a national provider and a donor advised fund at a community foundation to give more specific local giving. So again, people who are philanthropically inclined can have many, giving vehicles. It's an idea of, what's the best giving vehicle for their ultimate goals. And with a DAF, the big benefits can be, again, we are a 501c3 organization as National Philanthropic Trust. So as a charity, donors benefit by getting a charitable deduction. That's kind of the maximum charitable deduction. So for cash, they can use up to 60% of their charitable deduction against their AGI. For long-term capital assets, securities, bonds, funds, what have you, they could use that up to 30%. Again, avoid capital gains. With private foundations, the donor gets a little bit more control over those types of assets. They have a little bit more say. So the IRS kind of reduces, the benefits to them. So, with the DAF, you're really giving up a decent amount of control. The private foundation, you're retaining a bit of that control. But again, good charitable deductions if that's the goal for the client. And then again, at the bottom, the valuation of the donation, fair market value is huge, right? If you have a cost basis of $500,000 and you gift $1 million, you get $1 million charitable deduction. You avoid gains on that 500. With a private foundation, you get a $500,000 charitable deduction. It's a big delta between the two. But again, the goal is ultimately to figure out what is it that your client wants. And we are seeing an increasing number of clients that are inheriting private foundations and potentially converting them to donor advised funds, since there is a bit more upkeep. Again, you can go from private foundation to DAF. You can't go from DAF to private foundation, just to be clear on that. But again, it's really a matter of what is your client looking to do? What do they want to do? And what is the best giving vehicle for them? Or can you do that across multiple vehicles? So with that in mind, I want to share, at least one idea that I had with a advisor that I spoke to recently, if we can go to the next slide. And the idea is really around rebalancing. Again, as an advisor, a former advisor, the idea of tax loss harvesting every December, you're looking through a portfolio trying to find, potential, opportunity to harvest some losses to either offset gains that you've had that year or to build up a pool of losses for future gains. And that's a really common strategy. It's one that clients are used to hearing about on a regular basis. But what if we took that strategy and spun it a little bit differently? Instead of looking for losses, what if we leverage the gains that we have in the portfolio to not only accomplish a charitable goal, but also to help rebalance the portfolio? And that's something I wanted to show on the next slide. And again, this is something that I had a conversation with a group of advisors up in the Pacific Northwest. Their team love donor advised funds. They use them all the time. And I just asked them, what is your favorite strategy? And they like to call it asset replacement. You can call it whatever you want, but the means behind it is really what's in front of you. You have a donor who has a portfolio. Their target portfolio is a 60-40, a pretty conservative portfolio. But obviously, I know we're talking about this now in April, so it's been a bit volatile in the market more recently. But prior to this, we had some good run up, right? We had some good appreciation in the equity market. I know with interest rates going up, bond markets took a bit of a hit. So now their portfolio is a bit out of balance, right? It's now a little more aggressive at a 70-30. And again, the donor is charitably inclined. They're giving away $100,000 a year. So if you're looking to rebalance, get them back into a more conservative 60-40 portfolio, on the left is kind of a more traditional option. You can sell, some of the gains to pare it back and then buy back into the fixed income to get them back to that 60-40. But to do that, would cost the donor effectively $100,000 in taxes through capital gains. Now, on the right side, if you introduce a DAF to the idea, you can do this in a more tax efficient way and also help them with their philanthropic goals. So you can take that $1 million off the table, get them down to that 60-40 through the donor advised fund, avoid capital gains, get $1 million charitable deduction. And then when you get the proceeds in the DAF, you can use that to buy the fixed income. So now their holistic portfolio is back to that 60-40, but now they have, a little over $100,000 more in the total portfolio, with $1 million being already earmarked for giving. So instead of having to use $100,000 out of their checking account or calling you on a regular basis to, liquidate some stock to do it, they can just leverage their DAF and set up regular recurring grants to send out on an annual basis. Again, it's not the craziest strategy in the world, but it's a different way of using a very common scenario and incorporating a donor advised fund and philanthropy as a way to help you help your client. So I hope that was helpful, but I know, Matthias, you have some other potentially good ideas as
Janos,
well.
yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because I remember being an advisor, and yes, hopefully tax loss harvesting is kind of ubiquitous strategy right now. But I remember, especially for my clients that either had legacy wealth or much more mature portfolios, they were typically had some concentration in a particular position, and it was so hard to get them to diversify. Why? Because when the stock was up, I couldn't get them to sell because they didn't want to pay the taxes, and when the stock was down, they were waiting for it to go back up. Right. And so here's just another idea, right? Kind of flipping that script and allowing people to unlock capital that they were already probably going to use for philanthropic purposes, but thinking about it in a different way, in a tax advantage way. And so that can be so powerful. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, and something I wish I leveraged more when I was an advisor. Let's take a look at the next slide, if we would, and just kind of overview what Janos said, donating long-term appreciated capital gains. So that embedded capital gain, they are not going to pay the capital gains typically on the embedded capital gains in that asset. And so that's usually about 20% plus a 3.8% Medicare surcharge. That can be pretty impactful for a lot of people, especially as we're talking about legacy positions with very low cost basis, very high fair market value deduction. And in a donor advised fund, they're going to get that fair market value deduction. They can deduct up to 30% of their AGI against their AGI with a 5-year carry forward for such stock. And that goes up to 60% for cash. And so really powerful conversation, especially as markets fluctuate, right? Anytime there's money in movement, we want to be able to have a conversation with our clients and how they could better their financial future. So keep this one in mind. I want to share one other idea with you. So let's go to the next slide. And this is really applicable to any donor or client that maybe is experiencing a liquidity event. Maybe they're experiencing a windfall year, but also I really want you to think about your small business clients when it comes to this. NPT had a situation where a donor owned a $14 million trucking company. They had both a private foundation and a donor advised fund, but they were going to experience a liquidity event. Private equity firm was going to come in and buy them up. And so they wanted to donate about $2.5 million in private stock to the donor advised fund. Now, they could have donated it to their private foundation, but again, as Janos said, they're only going to receive a cost basis deduction. This trucking business was in the family for quite a long time, had kind of de minimis cost basis. Or they could donate to a public charity like a donor advised fund and get a fair market value deduction subject to 30% of AGI. Remember, they're experiencing this huge liquidity event anyways, and they're avoiding the embedded capital gains. And that can be a lot of capital unlocked for philanthropic and financial planning purposes. And again, even if this isn't a strategy that a client executes on, I want them to hear the idea from you rather than the advisor across the street, right? Here's why we're doing this, or here's why we're not doing this, can add so much value to the client relationship. And so let's go to the next slide here. And as I mentioned, anytime there's money in motion, that's a time for an advisor to add some value, right? And so optimizing for tax efficiency and aligning assets with long-term goals. So maybe they're not selling a huge business, but maybe they're getting ready to retire and they're redeeming stock and they're going to have a very large income year compared to maybe some of their other tax years. This can be a really good idea to start bunching our contributions, experiencing some tax relief, but also building up philanthropic capital for their legacy and for their philanthropic giving. Let's go to the next slide here. And I mentioned legacy. Always have these conversations, especially in relation to people's estate planning issues. And so there are a lot of assets on the balance sheet. I think IRAs, I think life insurance, that are not great charitable assets while a client is living, but they can be good assets after the client passes away. So an IRA or life insurance, for example, not a great asset to donate to charity while they're living, but upon their passing can be a really tax advantaged way to build their legacy and build their philanthropic capital if that's something that's important to them. But that requires some planning. And that's where you all come in having that conversation. And if you need ideas or how to have that conversation, feel free to reach out to us. It's kind of all we do, right? Have those conversations day in and day out. And we're happy to be a sounding board and also give you some ideas to that end. Let's go to the next slide here. And to that end, we're going to talk a little bit about NPT and the resources that we have. So Janos and myself, we're on the regional director team. So we have a number of people throughout the United States that work with advisors like yourself on new business development ideas, on pre-transaction gift planning. That has probably been 80% of my week this week, is just talking to advisors for clients experiencing a liquidity event, talking about complex assets, what works, what doesn't, and how to best serve their client. And for your clients that already have a donor advised fund, feel free to give us a call. We're here to support and give that white glove service that they care about, and help you administer their donor advised funds along with the rest of their philanthropic plan. And so with that, Janos, what ideas do you have in addition to that?
Oh, thanks so much, Matthias. And I think you did a great job covering kind of the incoming assets to MPT. I think one of the big things that, I wanted to focus on is, once we have the donor advised fund open, once the donor is ready to start giving out, what support can we be offering to help not only the client, but also you as the advisor. So, we do have an in-house, philanthropic consulting team called our Philanthropic Solutions team that can offer, a whole menu of kind of options to help clients. On the left side, you see here, coaching. I'm reminded of a story about 3 years ago. We had a donor who, kind of overnight, she became a success. So she had always talked about the ability to, she was used to what we would call checkbook philanthropy. She joked that, the only time she really would give is when her friends would have their birthday on Facebook and they would, sponsor a charity to say, give in my honor to this organization. That was her experience with philanthropy until, now she suddenly had capital and was looking for direction, right? She had areas that she cared about, but she wasn't sure how to really approach giving to those types of organizations. So, she worked with our team over, several months to just kind of learn the basics, right? How do you track the funds where they're going in terms of what good are they doing? Matthias had mentioned, you're giving away money to these organizations. What impact are you having? Helping her understand how to research those types of things or to talk, to the organizations themselves about what she was looking for. So, we can offer that kind of support if a donor is, looking for that kind of direction. Additionally, we're happy to do research on an ad hoc basis to find organizations that kind of fit a criteria that the donor is looking for, large or small. In terms of grant making, Matthias had mentioned our, affinity and our ability to handle international grant making. At this point, MPT is granted to, over 70 countries around the world, over 170, something different cities. We give to a lot of international organizations directly. So we are able to do that and are happy to do that for, all clients that join MPT. And then, of course, in terms of you as the advisor, we're happy to partner with you in terms of doing, family meetings, giving you ideas, workbooks, ways to approach this. Again, webinars like this, where we can share some ideas to make you, feel more empowered to have these conversations. So please, again, reach out to us early and often. We're happy to help. I'd be remiss if we can go to the next slide that I didn't touch on our, our own website, our donor portal called Giving Point. This is a tremendous resource. If you're an advisor who has a client who has a DAF with us, it's a tremendous resource for you to be able to go in, see what grant activity they've had, what organizations they've given to, look at, the contributions, be able to get gift receipts. This is a way for you to arm yourself with information to be able to, go into these meetings as prepared as possible. So, please, leverage Giving Point. You're able to kind of view all the information that you need so that you can do the research in one place and be ready for your client conversations. And with that, we can go on to the next slide. And then again, as Matthias mentioned, please reach out to us early and often. We're here to help be a sounding board, to help come up with ideas. We love getting phone calls from advisors asking, is this a potential DAF gift opportunity? Is this, I'm going into a client call. I think I'm going to talk about donor advised funds. Can you help me out a little bit? So please reach out to us. We're here to be a resource for you. And with that, we thank you so much for your time today and hope you were able to get a few ideas out of it.
Thank you.